Jack Selzer has taught a variety of composition and technical communication courses at Penn State since 1978, and he has collaborated with colleagues there and elsewhere in all kinds of ways. With Lester Faigley, he has written Good Reasons and Good Reasons with Contemporary Arguments, now in their 5th editions, and has also edited a number of versions of Conversations, Readings for Writing, now edited by Dominic Delli Carpini. Past president of the Rhetoric Society of America and of the Association of Teachers of Technical Writing, Jack currently directs Penn State's Paterno Fellows Program. He's published or edited a number of articles and books, including Rhetorical Bodies with Sharon Crowley, Kenneth Burke in the 1930s with Ann George, and Kenneth Burke in Greenwich Village. He currently enjoys teaching a first-year seminar on the rhetoric of the civil rights movement, and also happens to be a charter member of the longest continuously running fantasy sports league on the face of the earth. Jack, are you ready to begin?
Thanks, Amy. I think so.
Great.
I appreciate the plug for my fantasy baseball league. This is opening day, and actually after I'm done here today, I'll be going to Cincinnati for our annual auction. I'm sure everybody's really pleased to hear that. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for sitting in today. I sure appreciate your interest, and I'm wishing you good luck. This is my first experience with this sort of webinar presentation. I'm not exactly innovative or adept at new technologies, so wish me luck as I try to push my pedagogy into the 21st century. I want to thank Jean-Pierre Dufresne and Amy Berger for helping me put this together, as well as my Penn State colleague, doctoral student Bill Schraufnagel. Now, as Amy mentioned, my subject today is rhetorical analysis. Lester Faigley and I have been friends and collaborators for, let's just say, many years. And in our
Jack?
textbook, yeah.
Jack, sorry about that. Would you be able to share your screen by any chance?
Share my screen.
Yeah, or show your screen rather.
Yeah,
Sorry.
right, yeah. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Thanks. Go ahead.
Now, actually, Jean-Pierre,
Yep.
how can I minimize on my screen the
the orange arrow that's pointing to the right? If you click that, it'll minimize it.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, that's a good place to interrupt, actually, because I'm just getting started here.
Exactly.
I was mentioning that Lester Faigley and I have been friends and collaborators for, well, let's just say many years. And in our textbooks, we really have wanted to help students to do rhetorical analysis well. Rhetorical reading, rhetorical analysis, or critical reading, whatever you want to call it, it's very difficult, as you all know. And yet becoming adept at rhetorical analysis is absolutely critical, we're convinced, to growth in writing ability, as well as to the kind of critical citizenry that many of us hope to develop through our courses and programs. So I bet you share those convictions if you're here today. So let's get to it. What I hope to demonstrate, really, is the truth of one of Michael Leff's favorite professional paradoxes. There are, he once noted, and I'm quoting, two opposing dimensions of rhetoric, the one divisive, the other unifying. Rhetoric simultaneously divides and unifies, separates as it identifies, and it dwells most naturally in the in-between space where sameness and difference ambiguously embrace one another. Where do diversity and sameness meet on the human tongue and in the human condition, he asked. Mike wanted us to meditate together on this foundational paradox, this fundamental tension between concord and controversy. The imperative toward concord emerges from and assumes the presence of controversy. And the presence of controversy, it seems, breeds, as long as we're patient, a drive toward concord. It's a necessary symbiosis, if you will, concord and controversy. And while citing my professional hero, Kenneth Burke, Mike Leff challenged us all to attend to this paradox as we make the link between our professional calling as rhetorical scholars and our personal duty as public rhetors and citizens. So how do these two impulses, division and consubstantiation, Burke called them, how do they inevitably coexist? And to what extent is it true that the conflicting and the unifying must accompany each other? Well, a natural testing ground on which to study the issue and a natural site for rhetorical analysis would be the landscape before the Lincoln Memorial, site of our most canonical national rhetorical performance, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream oration delivered on August 28, 1963. In the process of considering this speech today, I'm going to be highlighting the tensions between concord and controversy as they developed before and during that day. But I will also and especially be offering my own modest recommendation for how to study and understand rhetorical action. So that's the real point of what we're doing today. My method of analysis has been inspired by Kenneth Burke and is rooted in the metaphor of conversation, because in that metaphor, I'm convinced, lies one means of recovering both concord and controversy in a way that can be as consistently telling for analysis as it is for production. What I'm going to be doing is recapturing some of the conversations, the discourses that were swirling about on that sultry August afternoon in 1963, as a way of illustrating how King's words were embroiled within larger networks of discourses that were in play, often in competition, in the summer of 1963. This is what Lester Faigley and I in our books call contextual analysis. I'll be attentive in particular to the voices of dissent that were operating within the civil rights movement, although you'll be hearing about expressions of concord too. And in reconstructing that conversation, I'll be looking to recover lost and forgotten voices in particular. Our collective task is to attend to both concord and controversy, I'm convinced. And that goes too for interpretations of the civil rights movement, which is still too frequently viewed as unrelievedly triumphal, unrelievably unified and cohesive, the happy crusade of dedicated heroes sacrificing and subordinating themselves and working in harmony to win out against intractable evil and oh so easy to recognize villains. So that's kind of the myth that I'm working against today. And finally, I'm going to give you something on the screen here. Let's start with these two images. This comes up. Jean-Pierre, you have to give me a hand here.
Hey, Jack, I'll be here.
Advancing my...
Yeah, I believe if you click on the screen, that should advance it.
Aha.
There we go. No problem.
Now, we want to start with these two images on the screen before you. This is a reproduction of Gary Will's Lincoln at Gettysburg, and this very well-known photo of King in the process of delivering his speech. These are the two iconic moments in American public oratory, aren't they? According to conventional lore, Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg changed American history. The title of Wills's prize-winning book on the speech is The Words That Remade America. And the story goes this way. Single-handedly, on a November day in 1863, or so the legend holds, single-handedly, Lincoln invented a new national identity by informing Americans that the promise of the Declaration of Independence, in particular the words, all men are created equal, could be realized only through a commitment to a new birth of freedom made on Civil War battlefields and in the hearts and minds of Americans. Except that we know now, through the work of a number of rhetorical scholars, that Lincoln did not alone invent those words or create independently any summons to a new birth of freedom. His references to the Declaration of Independence were part of a long tradition stretching back decades and including women arguing for equal rights with reference to the Declaration, including Harriet Beecher Stowe's amazingly popular Uncle Tom's Cabin, including Lincoln's own speech of July 7th that same year recalling the Declaration, and including Frederick Douglass's 1852 4th of July oration, among many others. So we know better now than to over-aggrandize the power of individual rhetors. We understand emancipation not as a revolutionary act by a great individual, but as an evolutionary and continuing change accomplished communally over time And nowadays, rather than sitting him on a lonely throne upon a pedestal, we put Lincoln into group portraits, as in the case, for instance, of Doris Kearns Goodwin's popular recent book, A Team of Rivals. My point today is very simple. I want to offer a reminder that in our scholarship and in our teaching, we must do the same with I Have a Dream. It's about teamwork. August 28, 1963, was not just King's Day. King's words did not emerge independently without discord or challenge, and we need to replace this image of King at the march. So we need to replace this image with this one, with King among a score of others. I Have a Dream was only one instrument being played in 1963 within an uneasy orchestra of often contending discourses. And I have time today to make my point by concentrating on two moments. The first occurred a few months before August, in mid-June 1963. Mid-June 1963, the period when the march was being formally authorized. June 11, 1963 to June 25, 1963 was one of the most fantastic fortnights in American history, if you ask me. As I think back on those weeks in my own life, there was a kind of normalcy to it all. I had just completed my freshman year. You're going to be glad to hear about this. I had just completed my freshman year at almost all-white McNicholas High School in an almost all-white suburb of mostly segregated Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents had my 7 brothers and sisters locked into the safe rhythms of life. We were doing outside chores around the house, preparing and consuming and cleaning up after meals, enjoying together the regular festival of whiteness known as network television. We watched Walt Disney and Bonanza on Sunday, Andy Griffith on Monday, Dick Van Dyke on Wednesday, My 3 Sons on Thursday, Gunsmoke on Saturday, all within the predictable cycles of church-going and schooling and growing up. And yet, as oblivious and as unengaged as I was then, there was really no way of ignoring the spectacular events taking place that June. If TV was still very white, top 40 music most decidedly was not. The Beach Boys, Bobby Vinton, and the Four Seasons were now sharing time with the Crystals and Stevie Wonder. The Ronettes may have looked white, especially in their beehive hairdos, but their music sounded like R&B and Motown. Martha and the Vandellas were singing about a heat wave, and Bob Dylan's answer was already blowing in the wind. If Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. No, and How the West Was Won were Cold War hit movies that I was seeing, I would be taking in also To Kill a Mockingbird with Gregory Peck, unveiled at Cannes on May 19th. I've consumed the daily newspaper since I first learned to read because it's always fed my interest in sports. And the Cincinnati Enquirer and Cincinnati Post and Time-Star, one arriving in the morning, one in the afternoon, insular as they were emphasizing the turmoil around the world. And so I remember the sensational headlines. Liberation political actions in Africa. Speculations about the prospects for the Second Vatican Council since the astounding Pope John XXIII had died on June 3rd. Gordon Cooper's orbit around the Earth in mid-May. And the Soviet answer, a launch of the first woman into space on June 16th. David Ben-Gurion's resignation as Prime Minister of Israel. The Supreme Court ruling outlawing prayer and Bible reading in public schools on June 17th. And political and military developments in a place called Vietnam, where Buddhists were resisting the corrupt American-sponsored Diem regime, setting themselves aflame and forcing Life magazine consumers like me to turn their thoughts to Indochina. If school had just let out for the summer in Cincinnati, school elsewhere was gripping national attention, because on Monday, June 11th, Governor George Wallace finally ended his lengthy resistance to the integration of the University of Alabama in the face of strong federal pressure embodied in Bobby Kennedy and federalized National Guard troops. During May and June, most notably in Birmingham, Alabama, but in 185 other communities as well, at least 700 demonstrations had taken place related to civil rights. Almost 15,000 people had been arrested, and countless acts of violence had been perpetrated on African Americans. Some of that turmoil had touched my own Cincinnati. The local NAACP chapter announced a drive to get 50,000 additional Negroes onto the voting rolls in the Cincinnati area. And I still remember well that my school had been embroiled in nothing less than a race-related riot that I had witnessed during a basketball game in March 1962. Integration was in progress, in other words, but very fitfully. And my friends who worked the amusement park swimming pool 3 miles from my house were reporting occasional difficulties enforcing the segregation conventions that African Americans were challenging. On the evening of June 11th, flush with the triumph over Wallace, but chastened and sobered by all that civil unrest, President Kennedy was moved to address the nation, and I recall watching television with my parents and older siblings in our family room as he used the Alabama incidents as the occasion to announce plans for civil rights legislation that would ensure desegregated facilities and schools as well as voting rights. Departing at several points from his semi-prepared text, Kennedy from the heart offered ringing endorsements of freedom, a word he used a dozen times in his 12 minutes on television. For informally, but very widely, the slogan for that summer had already become free in 63.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures, and it is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it. And we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens, except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise.
So let me repeat a few of Kennedy's words there as a way of transition. This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. And 100 years have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, and yet their heirs are not fully free. Now is the time for this nation to fulfill its promise. 3 hours later, 3 hours after this speech, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was murdered at his home in Jackson, Mississippi. I wasn't shocked at the murder in 1963 in the sense of being surprised, to be honest. There was lots of big talk and furtive whispering in my respectable, segregated suburb about acquiring guns and guarding access to our community. And while I never heard or saw any gunplay myself, I read about it in the papers. And in the following summers, National Guardsmen would patrol the peaceful streets that I walked home from school with a show of force to discourage vigilantism. The Evers funeral took place in Jackson on June 15th. He was then buried in Arlington National Cemetery on June 19th. And on the days before and following the funeral, as John Doerr was facing down a potential riot in Jackson, Kennedy was convening a June 22nd meeting at the White House that would include King, you can see him in this photo, representing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, 74-year-old A. Philip Randolph, the venerable labor-leading head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. That's him on the very left. John Lewis, newly elected chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who is not visible in this photo. Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers, you can see him. Bobby Kennedy in the front row, LBJ. Whitney Young of the Urban League, and of course Roy Wilkins, leader of the NAACP. Roy Wilkins is standing between Bobby Kennedy and LBJ there. These assembled leaders discussed the particulars of the civil rights legislation that Kennedy had proposed, the bipartisan support that legislation had already attracted, the means of overcoming the likely Senate filibuster opposing it, as well as the advisability of a march on Washington in support of that legislation. Kennedy, though skeptical, didn't oppose the march, but other people certainly did oppose. There was anything but concord at that meeting. One of the opponents was someone not invited to the meeting. Malcolm X claimed many times that the meeting was simply an effort to co-opt the liberation movement by integrating and domesticating it. But another opponent of the march was present, Roy Wilkins. Fresh from a stretch in the Jackson jail himself, Wilkins vociferously objected to the march, partly out of a continuing rivalry with King, partly out of a concern that financial resources dedicated to his NAACP would end up elsewhere, partly because of rumors that communists were behind the march, partly out of his concerns about a violent backlash from the white community, as was realized in the murder of Medgar Evers. Should the NAACP retain its leadership position, or should it share it with, or even yield it to, unruly but impassioned grassroots marching in the streets movements? Recall that the NAACP and SNCC had openly ridiculed and mocked King's actions during the Albany movement of 1962, and that the most recent issue of the Saturday Evening Post had accused King of, quote, arrogance and opportunism, unquote, and that the triumph we now understand as the Birmingham campaign, letter from Birmingham jail, and that the triumph we now understand as the Birmingham campaign had no means been secured, as the murders of 4 little girls, among others, would prove on September 15th. Randolph, meanwhile, had already been planning an October march of his own in support of job opportunities, having, well, dreamed of such a thing since at least 1941. As Malcolm X related in his autobiography, a grassroots movement for a march had been percolating that spring in concert with Randolph's plans. And so when Randolph accepted leadership of an August march instead, its agenda was expanded. The March on Washington would be a march for jobs and freedom, not just for the freedom issues of desegregation, educational opportunity, and voting rights. Okay, that was on June 22nd. The next day after that June 22nd meeting, Kennedy left for Europe. On June 23rd, he was greeted in Bonn by 500,000 cheering Germans. Toward the end of his trip, on June 26th, he gave the most ringing freedom speech of his public life, the memorable I'm a Berliner's address. 15 of the 671 words that Kennedy used that day were free or freedom, in his challenge to the world that Ronald Reagan reprised in 1987 and that Barack Obama knew all too well when he spoke in the same city in the summer of 2008. Kennedy's speech is conventionally remembered as a Cold War call for the end of the Berlin Wall and for political openness in East Berlin and East Germany. But his words were constructed as much by events in Africa, Birmingham, Jackson, and Albany, and throughout the segregated North and South. And his words were constructed in part by words spoken in Detroit as well. For while Kennedy was being welcomed in Bonn, and while Klansman Byron Beckwith was being arrested for the murder of Medgar Evers, King was being welcomed in Detroit, appearing at a huge, effervescent, and peaceful rally. 20 years to the day after a bloody Detroit riot claimed 34 lives and required, even during, I forgot to show you the Kennedy at Berlin. And here's the photo of that Detroit event. This happened 20 years to the day after a bloody Detroit riot had claimed 34 lives and required, even during wartime, the installation of federal troops. Isn't that an amazing photo? Over 125,000 people took part in that march down Broad Woodward Avenue on that Sunday, June 23rd. But it was not with the support of the NAACP and not without all kinds of local feuding, documented authoritatively by Taylor Branch and many others. The Detroit March was organized not by the NAACP, but by the legendary Reverend C.L. Franklin, son of Mississippi sharecroppers and pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. Famous as the $1 Million Voice because his sermons were carried on the radio and because of his wonderful singing voice. Maybe you've heard of his daughter, Aretha Franklin. Supporters of Reverend Franklin, who had invited King, were calling NAACP leaders a bunch of Uncle Toms. NAACP leaders publicly boycotted the rally, and for another month, Roy Wilkins would remain suspicious of such popular uprisings unless they were explicitly sanctioned by his NAACP. The Detroit March was also opposed by a growing body of black nationalists, impatient with nonviolence and integration, who ridiculed Franklin and regarded King himself as a Tom. 6 months later, after all, on November 10th at another Detroit rally, this one publicly opposed by Franklin, Malcolm X would rip and ridicule the march on Washington in his famous anti-King diatribe known as Message to the Grassroots. But let me resist the temptation to digress too much further from June 23rd, although it deserves detailed attention in its own right. At the end of the Detroit March, King offered his full support to Kennedy's proposed legislation, concluding his 48-minute speech this way. So you listen to this for a couple of minutes.
So I go back to the South not in despair. I go back to the South not with a feeling that we are caught in a dark dungeon that will never lead to a way out. I go back believing that the new day is coming. And so this afternoon I have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day, right down in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to live together as brothers. I have a dream this afternoon that one day little white children and little Negro children will be able to join hands as brothers and sisters. I have a dream this afternoon that one day men will no longer burn down houses in the Church of God simply because people want to be free. I have a dream this afternoon that there will be a day that we will no longer face the atrocities that Emmett Till had to face or Medgar Evers had to face, but that all men can live with dignity. I have a dream this afternoon that my four little children will not come up in the same young days that I came up within, but they will be judged on the basis of the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I have a dream this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a house anywhere that their money will carry them. They will be able to get a job. Yes, I have a dream this afternoon. One day in this land, the words of Amos will become real. Justice will roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. I have a dream this evening that one day we will recognize the words of Jefferson that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I have a dream this afternoon
So that was Detroit, June 23rd, 1963. The words still electrify, don't they? And so you get my point. From the beginning of March on Washington preparations, there was plenty of concord, but also plenty of dissent within the movement. Controversy amid the controversy. The good guys were sometimes hard to tell from the bad, and many lines in I Have a Dream were already written by the end of June, so to speak, by a number of people. The apparent disjuncture that so many have commented on in King's I Have a Dream speech, the internal conflict between the first half's emphasis on jobs and the Let Freedom Ring peroration was not really so much a conflict at all as an inevitable consequence of the two themes of the march. Kennedy's promise at the end of his TV address would morph easily into King's promissory note. And indeed, the first section of King's speech mirrors in many ways the phraseology of Kennedy's addresses on TV and in Berlin. I Have a Dream includes not just King's formulations rehearsed in Detroit, but phrases owing to Scripture, to Randolph and Franklin, to Lincoln and Gandhi, to Malcolm X, to the Battle Hymn of the Republic, to the Declaration of Independence, and to who knows who and what else. Marian Anderson famously sang My Country 'Tis of Thee on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in 1939, so no wonder King recited the words of the song in the same place in 1963. And did King pinch his I Have a Dream phrase itself from activist Prathia Hall in the 1962 Albany campaign, and his Let Freedom Ring refrain from Chicago preacher Archibald Carey's address at the 1952 Republican National Convention, as Michael Eric Dyson has contended, citing Keith Miller? For my second episode, let's flash forward quickly. I realize my time is getting short. Let's flash forward to August 28, 1963 itself, a day which, while legendarily peaceful thanks to the organizational genius of Bayard Rustin, did not lack for moments of discourse, believe me. Here's the program for that day. Now, as you scan this document, note that this was a very full schedule of presentations. Each person was consequently given just 7 minutes to speak, maximum. So the consequent and uncharacteristic brevity of King's speech was assured by Rustin's insistence on that limitation. Note also that the uneasy coalition addressing the assembled multitudes had many and sometimes conflicting goals, reflected not just in the full title of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but also embodied by the people gathered for the event: black workers, farmers, disenfranchised citizens, black and white entertainers, students, and clergy. Speakers represented the fragile Popular Front coalition, including Wilkins' NAACP, Young's Urban League, James Farmer's Congress on Racial Equality, John Lewis's SNCC, Walter Reuther's United Auto Workers, and King's SCLC, not to mention the Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish religious leaders that you see. All of them negotiated multiple needs and aims and opportunities, and they uneasily accommodated all kinds of difference in the interests of an important show of discord, of concord. Now, you probably already know about the increasing impatience and radicalism that emerged during the summer of 1963 in SNCC. SNCC Chair John Lewis had to be toned down in his presentation on August 28th as a result of vigorous negotiations that were occurring even as the first speeches were being given. Negotiations that required the insertion of another speaker into this program to fill the resulting gap in the person of the mercurial Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, the man long in the middle of the Birmingham campaign, fire hose during May and since 1961 shuttling between Birmingham and my hometown of Cincinnati as the pastor of Revelation Baptist Church located near Crosley Field. Lewis, under pressure from his elders, finally agreed not to use charged terms in his speech, terms like the masses and revolution and Sherman's March to the Sea, in order to keep the peace. Incidentally, 497 of my fellow Cincinnatians, according to the August 28th Cincinnati Enquirer, some of them perhaps the religious nuns who taught at my high school, traveled together to the march on a special overnight train organized by an interfaith and interracial committee of church leaders. The march happened to take place while the Ohio Valley Jazz Festival was attracting to Cincinnati the likes of Cannonball Adderley, Oscar Peterson, and Thelonious Monk, and a particular fan from Louisville, still named Cassius Clay, whose photo in the Cincinnati Enquirer on August 30th quoted him as saying, "If Liston gives me any jive, I'll just take him in 5." And you won't be surprised at the gradualism that still prevailed within SCLC and NAACP on August 28th. White leaders such as Archbishop Patrick O'Boyle, who delivered the invocation once he was satisfied that Lewis wouldn't go off, and black activist Benjamin Mays, who offered the benediction, did not really share a lot of common ground. And not a lot of people were real pleased either by the succession of remarkable women who were either excluded from the roster of speakers or simply honored in brief special tribute that you see: Rosa Parks, Diane Nash, Mrs. Medgar Evers. Or those who were just simply invited to perform, like Mahalia Jackson and Marian Anderson. Almost all the white congressmen and senators boycotted the march, carrying on their usual business. The 3 congressmen from Cincinnati certainly boycotted it. But so did Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who thought that whites should be kept out of the movement. And so did Malcolm X, who continued to refer to the whole show as the farce in Washington, who indicated on August 25th that no Muslims will be involved, and who nevertheless couldn't resist attending the march on the edges. In short, the rhetorical situation faced by King and the others gathered that day before the Lincoln Memorial was highly complex, as full of dissonance as consonance, controversy as much as concord. And why wouldn't it be so? Concord and controversy always travel together. Like Mr. Lincoln enthroned behind him, King spoke on August 28th for and against many others, not just in his own words, but channeling the words of others. And he spoke in a way that only imperfectly and incompletely muted dissent. I don't mean just that it's our responsibility as rhetorical scholars to understand the broad social dimension of King's personal performance, how it was instigated and even articulated by many others, including Mahalia Jackson, who is said to have goaded King into leaving his script and concluding, quote, by telling about the dream, unquote, or how it took place as whispers circulated through the crowd that the old man, W.E.B. Du Bois, had passed away just hours before in Ghana. Though all of that, too. I mean that we have to acknowledge the voices of many others in that speech. The voices of Kennedy and Shuttlesworth, Lewis and Evers, Wilkins and Anderson, Randolph and Rustin and Carey. Voices heard in Berlin and Detroit, Jackson and Birmingham. So let's therefore, when we do rhetorical analysis, encourage students and the public to understand the March on Washington, not as a stage for the heroic King to address anonymously assembled passive masses, but as a people's movement. When we do, we will not at all be diminishing the achievement of Martin Luther King, Jr., but will be attending to the fullness of his genius, courage, and savvy. And when we do, we'll be doing rhetorical analysis in a way that does justice to Kenneth Burke and Michael Leff's knowing insight that consensus never comes without controversy, and concord is always accompanied by criticism. As much as possible, we have to recover the full conversation when we do contextual rhetorical analysis. Recover that full conversation. And we should probably remember all that, not just when we're in the active analysis, but also when we're advising prospective student rhetors too. Let's teach those students that no active rhetoric really ends a discussion, that it's a rare moment indeed when someone will say, thanks for clearing that up, and that they can always expect criticism of one kind or another when they enter into public discourse. Rhetoric is a rough and tumble contact sport, as well as a team sport, and it takes people with a very thick skin to play it. So that's the point of my talk. I hope you're still with me. Thanks for listening. And now let's see if there's any questions.
Okay, we have a question from Rosemary Fisk. She writes, Jack, I'm in Hong Kong and will be teaching Dr. King's rhetoric in Zhuhai, China very soon. Any advice for this context, given the continued imprisonment of a Nobel Peace Prize winner? Thanks.
Boy, that's a great question, because the whole point of teaching these discourses is not just to recover them as historical artifacts, but as things that are still speaking.
Mm-hmm.
So what comes to mind really is that just as King himself was embroiled in all of these conversations, so his words now can be inserted into contemporary conversations, even in another country. So I would, I guess I'd advise letting the students see what relevance there is. Let the students read King right into that controversy. But I'd sure like to hear her talk about, the question writer, I'd like to hear her testify and tell me how it all turns out. Interesting.
Very. Are there other questions? If anyone wants to send one in, we'll be able to see it right away.
I think I put him to sleep because it went on too long.
I don't think so. Let's see. There's a question here from Elizabeth Perkins, but I don't see the text of the question itself. So maybe Elizabeth can resubmit if that, okay. Colleen White wants to know, how can I allow my students to show how contemporary discussions concerning Dr. King can still be relevant?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, how can I allow my students to show how contemporary discussions concerning Dr. King can still be relevant?
Well, I think your first challenge is going to be to establish that there are controversies about King. I think King has been canonized now. He's kind of like Mr. Lincoln on the seat of the Lincoln Memorial. We now think of Lincoln as the great hero, the brilliant leader who got us through the Civil War. He's considered our greatest American president and so on. But gosh, during his lifetime, he was buffeted by controversy. He was in danger of losing the election in 1964. So I think the challenge would be to get King off of that pedestal somehow. Why is King still a controversial figure? How can they make him into a controversial figure? I think it's going to take a little bit of scholarship for them to see how King was, just one of among many leaders contending for attention in the 1960s. In the 1960s, he wasn't the only person out there. He's been selected for certain reasons, and there's been certain things that have been left out of his story. So I would say the challenge is to reconstitute that historical moment so that the students can perceive that King was a flesh and blood guy involved in controversy as well as concord. And then I think there's still that contemporary conversation in Dyson's work and in some others. People are still kind of wondering whether or not King deserves the adulation that he's received.
That's interesting because it connects to your earlier point that that rhetoric itself is that these speeches and other acts of rhetoric are not historical artifacts. There's that same kind of tendency to turn King himself into a historical artifact, and you're saying that you have to recover both of those as living, breathing things worthy of analysis rather than let them kind of become static objects.
That's right, Amy, and I think kind of to reemphasize my largest point, that you just can't read I Have a Dream as a isolated speech disconnected from other discourses. You've got to reinsert all of these things into the larger conversations that are going on at a particular moment. And I think the fun for students and the challenge for students is to do their best to reconstruct those conversations. When you do a rhetorical analysis of something going on today, it's kind of easy because you've already heard the discussion, so to speak. You've heard the controversies. They're available in the newspapers, on television, and talk shows, and so on. But something like I Have a Dream or a speech by Lincoln or by John Kennedy or somebody else, you know, it takes research to reconstruct that original moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that students actually can do that research. They enjoy rediscovering that historical moment. And of course, they learn a lot about the richness of rhetoric when they do it.
Mm-hmm. Jack, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but there are two questions here that kind of piggyback off what you were just saying. Well, one doesn't, but it's a practical question. Mary Thompson wants to know if we can get your slides and from you and distribute those. And if that's good with you, you could send them to me, Jack, and we'll get the slides out to attendees that want them. Would you think that would be possible?
Actually, there's permissions issues.
Oh, sure.
So I'll have to check into this. I would mention that a version of this presentation is going to be published in a book put out in the next few months by the Rhetoric Society of America. It's edited by Tony DeVelasco at the University of Memphis. And he also has found, he's been able to get permission to reproduce a lot of these materials. So I would refer Mary to that maybe as a reliable source. But I'm really complimented that she found the visuals interesting. I actually, in the process of putting this together, I, gathered up 40 or 50 images. And those are the kinds of things I'm going to bring into my class in the fall on the rhetoric of the civil rights movement. Because the students, as Mary knows, they respond very much to the visual rhetoric, and it adds a lot of immediacy to these discussions.
Yeah, we had a lot of requests for the materials, Jack, and a lot of affirmations that no one was asleep. And we have several other questions. We're going to go ahead and send those to you, Jack, and so we can let everybody go on and move on to the next session. But thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, and thanks to everyone who attended.
My pleasure, Amy, and thanks again for nursing me through the whole thing.
No trouble.
Good luck, everybody.